Well, howdy everyone. Today I'm taking a look at another lens that's been popular for a long time, the Canon 70-300mm f4 to 5.6 IS USM. This is an affordable, image-stabilized telephoto lens that will work on all Canon's digital SLR cameras. I'm going to test it on a full-frame Canon 6D camera, but I'll also give you some APS-C test results, as most people use APS-C cameras. The lens zooms all the way from 70 to 300mm. This is a really nice zoom range. The f4 to f5.6 maximum aperture is typical for this kind of lens, but it really doesn't let in a lot of light, and you get changes in light levels as you zoom in and out. So this lens wouldn't be your first choice for shooting, say, indoor sports events. The lens itself is pretty big, as you can see here, and it's also fairly weighty. It feels nice to hold in your hand, although the focus and zoom rings are slightly wobbly. The zoom ring works really nice and smoothly, which is great to see. The focus ring is quite precise, but maybe not the smoothest. You can feel gears turning as you move it, but it gets the job done perfectly well. Annoyingly, the front element of the lens twists and extends as you focus, which is irritating for polarizing filter users, as it basically is a bit old-fashioned. The autofocus is reasonably fast and not too noisy in use, but it's not exactly silent either. However, it did focus very accurately in my tests, which is maybe the most important thing. Maybe the nicest feature of this lens is its image stabilization. It's enabling me to get this nice, smooth video footage, and it'll also help you to get sharp photos when there isn't much light. I think it works much more smoothly than Tamron's image stabilization, which is a little jerky. The only problem is that it makes quite a loud clicking noise, which gets picked up by your camera's internal microphone, which gets louder as you zoom in to 300mm. You can hear it quite clearly in this footage. The stabilization has two modes. The first is for dual axis correction, and mode 2 just corrects the vertical plane, which is useful if you're doing panning shots. Overall, the lens handles well and it's built quite nicely, although the autofocus system is a little outdated nowadays. Let's look at the picture quality. These pictures were taken on a full-frame camera, a 20-megapixel Canon 6D. I'll give you the APS-C test results a little later in the review, for those of you with one of Canon's less expensive APS-C cameras. Let's zoom out to 70mm and check out the picture quality at f4. As you can see, the middle of the frame is nice and sharp, with decent colours and contrast, and the corners are, well, they're also really nice and sharp. What a good performance. Things are even better when you stop the lens's aperture down to f5.6, and if you stop all the way down to f8, the image is razor sharp from the corners back into the middle. So the lens is fantastic at 70mm. We'll zoom in a bit to 135mm. The lens's maximum aperture is now f5, so not particularly fast. Image quality in the middle of the frame is good, but slightly softer than it was at 70mm. However, the corners are just as sharp, so that's fairly commendable. If you stop the lens down to f8, there's a very nice improvement, and the lens is very sharp back in the middle too. So there's a slight quality degradation at 135mm, but it's still a very good performance. Let's zoom the lens in to 200mm, where the maximum aperture is still f5. The image quality in the middle is slightly softer again, but at least the corners aren't any worse. This is still an acceptable performance. Stop down to f8 and the corners become fairly sharp, and the middle of the image is also much better. These aren't fantastic levels of sharpness, but they are pretty good nonetheless. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 300mm, where the maximum aperture is now f5.6. If we look closely at the center of the image, the picture quality is still fairly good. It's still reasonably sharp for most uses, so it's not a bad performance. The corners, however, have gone downhill, looking pretty soft, and some chromatic aberration is clearly visible on contrasting edges. If you stop the lens down to f8, then there's a mild improvement in the corners, but the middle of the image becomes very sharp, and at f11 there's another tiny improvement. So, on a full-frame camera, the Canon 70-300mm IS USM gives a very solid performance, becoming very sharp when you stop down the aperture a little. The weakest area is when the lens is zoomed into 300mm, where you'll never really get sharp corners, but they're certainly pretty good, and the middle of the frame is certainly very sharp. It's a good performance for a lens which isn't very expensive. Well then, let's take a look at how this lens performs on an APS-C camera, in this case, my Canon 60D. Most people have APS-C digital cameras. Basically, if your camera cost under £1,000, it's APS-C. As you can see here, 70mm is much more zoomed in on APS-C. This becomes a serious telephoto lens. At f4, the picture is fairly sharp from the middle of the image frame all the way into the corners. If you stop down to f5.6, there's a very nice increase in sharpness and contrast. There's also barely any chromatic aberration on contrasting edges. So basically, it's a very nice performance at 70mm. Zoom in a little to 135mm and, at the maximum aperture of f5, the picture is still nice and sharp, although there's a little ghosting on contrasting edges. Look in the corners and we have exactly the same story. Stop the lens down to f8 and the corners become pretty good, and the middle of the image is very sharp indeed. This is good, but it's a shame you have to stop down to f8 to get this sharp. When we zoom all the way into 300mm, there's bad news for APS-C camera owners. The picture has become quite soft from the middle of the frame into the corners. What a shame. Stop down to f8 for an improvement from the corners and back in the middle. If you're shooting on an APS-C camera, then this lens can perform quite well, especially with the aperture stopped down, but at 300mm there are some serious problems. If you need sharp pictures at 300mm, then a Tamron 70-300mm VC USD lens would be a much better option for you. So overall, the lens is a reasonably good performer in terms of sharpness and chromatic aberration. I'm glad to say that there aren't too many other image quality issues to worry about. Seeing as this is a telephoto lens, distortion isn't a big problem, and vignetting can be cleared up by your camera's peripheral illumination. The lens doesn't particularly appreciate working against bright light, producing lots of interesting lens flare and a lack of contrast, as you can see here. However, I am glad to say that the quality of the bokeh on this lens is pretty nice. There's no harshness or weird highlights, so your out of focus backgrounds will always look pretty smooth. Overall, this lens is showing its age a little, but it still handles well and it works very nicely. It's a better lens on full frame cameras than it is on APS-C. The picture quality is generally good and the image stabilization is very nice, if a little bit noisy. There are nicer telephoto zoom lenses out there these days, but also much worse ones. Its biggest competitor is the much newer Tamron 70-300mm VC USD, which seems to be a bit better, but I've only tested it on APS-C so far. I'll try to test it on full frame in the new year. People with APS-C cameras might want to consider the Tamron instead, unless there's a big price difference. But overall, I like the Canon 70-300mm IS USM. It's alright, and it's not bad value for money.